Welcome. Thank you all for coming. My name is Kaya Mark. I am a current 3L at Vermont Law and Graduate School, and I will be moderating this session today. I'm really excited to hear what our panelists have to share and really hope that you enjoy yourself as well. A few quick things just so everyone knows. This session is using a webinar format, meaning only our panelists will appear on camera and be able to unmute. All other participants are in listen-only mode. The chat will be open and attendees may submit questions in the Q&A at any time. When you do submit questions, if you can also put your degree and year in there so we know what year you graduated from, that would be great. After we do our own questions, we'll have time at the end to go over a live question if anyone wants to share or ask anything then. In addition, this session will be recorded. It's currently recording, I believe, and will later be posted on the VLGS YouTube page. And with that, I think we'll get started. Dave Celone, class of 92, is going to give a brief background on Anthony Doria and Royalton College and the founding of Vermont Law School.
Well, thank you, Kaya, and thank you, panelists and everyone for joining. It's great to be here and great to have so many people who are interested in learning a little bit more about Founding Day, December 5th, 1972, which is when the Articles of Incorporation for Vermont Law School were filed with the Secretary of State's office in Vermont. So that's why we're celebrating this day on December 5th. Now, there's a little bit of a backdrop, and I wasn't around back at that time, so I'm relying on a book that's titled Vermont Law School, The First 25 Years, for a few anecdotes and paraphrasing some things that happened. But I noted, I found a student newspaper article from May 3rd, 1976, the special graduation edition of The Forum, which was the student newspaper even when I was a student in the late 80s, early 90s, titled The Preposterous and Altogether Unlikely Case of Vermont Law School, written by a member of the class of 1976. Peter probably knows him. His name is Joe Torrey. And another article in that same paper, which was written by another one of your classmates, Peter, his name is Larry Olive, also class of 76, who was recounting how when he showed up in South Royalton in June and then again in July of 1973, he was astounded to find no mention of Vermont Law School on any sign. All he saw was a sign that said Royalton College, School for International Affairs, and was really questioning whether a school existed. So the really question that this all begets is what happened and how did it come into being? And it was really all founded by and created by a gentleman named Anthony Doria, who was the first dean of the school, founded the school. He was a native of Italy who came to the United States in 1949. He held a Doctor of Jurisprudence degree from the University of Rome. Again, I'm paraphrasing, reading from this First 25 Years book. And he had studied international law and relations. And he founded the school, Vermont Law School, as it was known then, as part of the Royalton College School for International Affairs that he had established previously in 1966. So he came from Rome, moved to Pennsylvania up to Vermont, and the rumor that I've heard is that his car ran out of gas somewhere near South Royalton, and that's how he wound up in South Royalton. So stories about Dean Doria abound. He was colorful. He was a charming person. I'll get to the story where I met him for lunch and spent time in his house one afternoon in the summer of 1995 in just a minute. But I also want to mention that he really spent time recruiting people who were going to be not just the first professors, but also board members for the Board of Trustees. So really motivated, really entrepreneurial from what I can tell. And from when I met him, that was clear. He's that kind of personality. But he recruited Professor Harold Berman of Harvard Law School, who taught an introductory course in the Western legal tradition. He recruited Alan Weinberger, John Minahan Jr., Les Pete, Lowell Schechter, and Gary Matola as full-time faculty. He also recruited Professor David Firestone, who many people know, who's still teaching. We did ask Professor Firestone, as well as Professor Teachout, who was not one of the first professors, but certainly an early professor, to join us today. They unfortunately weren't able to attend, but hopefully for those of you who come back June 26th to 28th for Alumni Weekend, you'll see them and other former faculty members and current faculty members. So just another quick sort of bit of history is that in 1973, VLS was certified by the Vermont Board of Education as an institution of higher learning. And at the same time, the ABA was looking at the school for accreditation. And this would have been in January 1974 when the ABA sent a delegation to look at the school. And they decided not to make a recommendation, which was not making an adverse decision. It was just simply not making a decision. And so anxiety levels were running high. And at about that time, a student working in the library found a 1960 Pennsylvania decision that affirmed that First Dean Anthony Doria's conviction for obtaining a loan by false pretense. That conviction was ultimately vacated in 1976 after the witness in the case admitted that he had lied. So still, there was tension, there was anxiety. Dean Doria worked with the board. The board had a wonderful gentleman who was the then trustee named Thomas Debevoise, a name that everybody knows, with Debevoise Hall, actually, which is the picture behind me now. And he agreed to step in as the school's second dean. So the trustees announced that Anthony Doria had agreed to step down. Thomas Debevoise took over the deanship. And at the ceremony, Dean Debevoise said, "Dr. Doria has dared to do something that many have dreamed of. He has done it. He has started a law school." So on this founding day, certainly I am tremendously proud of the school and what it has become and what I expect it will continue to do over time. I like to reflect and think about the founding of the school and the founder of the school, Anthony Doria, and thank him and certainly celebrate what he did to create something out of nothing in a tiny little town in South Royalton, Vermont. You know, they call it the school without a stoplight or a traffic light. That was the case then, and it's certainly the case now. So I will say that the story that I was mentioned that I would tell you is when summer of 1995, I was working at the school in a prior iteration in the development office as the director of annual giving, and I received a phone call from someone named Anthony Doria, who asked me if I had a poster of the bell tower, which was the image of a print made by Sabra Field, a local Vermont artist, and the school had reproduced it and created posters, and he wanted a copy of the poster and asked if I would join him for lunch at his house, which I did the next day, and went to his house, which was just across Route 14 on a hill looking down over the school, over the White River. And it was probably, I would say, the most colorfully memorable lunch of my lifetime, bar none, with anyone. This was really, truly, Dean Doria was one of the most charming, energetic people that I've met. And he had stories that just sort of, he could lapse into Greek philosophy and quote Greek philosophers as easily as he could talk about the weather outside that day. So we were sitting on the back porch. It was a bit of a Saturday Night Live sketch routine kind of thing where he had a chef and concierge named Robert, who was just on the other side of the wall where we were sitting on the porch. pounding away at chicken, tenderizing it for a meal that he was cooking for us, which was chicken piccata, which turned out to be, again, just a fabulous meal that I'll remember for the rest of my life. It was really good food. While a nurse was wheeling Dean Doria's mother in a wheelchair, sort of from position to position to keep her out of the sun on this porch, back porch, looking out over the town. And Dean Doria was regaling me with stories about his political career. He'd run for office for the Vermont House once, twice for the Senate, and he had some posters that he was showing me. And all the while was telling me about how proud he was about the law school and how well it had done. And in fact, it was doing quite well. It was doing extremely well. My class, which had graduated just a few years before I met him, I think was one of the largest classes in the history of the school. And things just seemed to be marching along in a fashion that he really effused over. And so he then sort of drew his arm wide in an arc and said, "Look out there and tell me what you see." And so I looked and I said, "Well, I see mostly trees." And he sort of got, animated and said, "No, no, no, no." He said, "What do you see? What colors do you see?" And I said, "Well, I see greens, I see some blues, I see some whites." He said, "No, look at the school. What colors do you see?" And I said, "Well, I see whites, I see greens." He said, "Well, look harder." I said, I see white, I see green, I see red on the school." He said, "That's it." He said, "That's why I asked you here. That's why I asked you for the poster." He said, "What do those colors suggest to you?" And as dense as I was, I just couldn't come up with whatever the response that he wanted. And he said, "Look, I invited you here because you have an Italian sounding last name. And I'm Italian. I emigrated from Rome to the United States. I created this law school. What colors do you see on the bell tower?" And I said, red, white, and green, the colors of the Italian flag. And at that point, he sort of, threw his arms up, clapped, and said, "That's it. I had it painted that to memorialize the country where I'm from." And he sort of turned it into an immigration conversation, really, an immigrant's conversation, someone who came from one continent to another and was able to create this school. And I was, really just sort of stunned that he was so, and this is many years after he had been the dean, after he had founded the school, he was just so excited, really excited about what this school had become. And so I think that's probably as much as I'll relate right now. My time is probably up, but that's the story. And hopefully I've conveyed a little bit, enough about the history to get a sense, which, maybe Professor Dycus, Nina, and Peter can add to. And I'll turn it back to you, Kaya.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave, for sharing that history. That was really interesting and funny story. Yeah, so introducing our panelists, I would love for each of you to just do a brief introduction and share how you came to Vermont Law School. And I think let's start with Peter Nowlan, class of 76.
Thank you. My story, I think, is different from and typical of all of my classmates at Vermont Law School. So I had graduated from the University of Vermont in 1968 when the Vietnam War and the draft was going strong. And I had a couple of job offers from industry, and I had a job offer from my Uncle Sam that I couldn't refuse. So I went into the service and eventually got into an officer candidate school and completed that, did a tour in Vietnam, but my status was what they called indefinite. So I didn't have a particular discharge date, but I had windows that I could choose it. And I ended up being in the service longer. And early in 1973, I realized that I had a window coming up in July where I could elect to get out, or I'd have to stay in a few more years. So by that time I was married and I was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and I elected to get out on July 5th or 7th or something. And I had 2 months of leave time saved up, so I got 2 months' pay. And my wife and I drove back to Vermont, where her parents and my parents were. And that was on a Thursday when we got back to Vermont, and I was going through the Rutland Herald, and I saw an article announcing Vermont Law School, describing how it had just started its summer session that week. And I had an interest in going to law school, so I said to my wife, I think I'll drive up tomorrow and look at it. I'd never heard of it, but it just started. So the next morning, I walked into the classroom building and walked into the office. Kilby DeWitt was there, and I told her I was there. I had just read about it, and I had an interest in law school, so I just wanted to see what it was like. And she said, well, we're all filled up. You can't get in now. And I said, I understand that. I said, I was thinking about perhaps applying for next year. And she was kind of giving me the short shrift, and this short guy walked in with torn canvas shoes and a white golf shirt, and she introduced me to Dr. Doria. And I explained to him I was just up here trying to find out some information in case I wanted to apply in the future. And he brought me into his office. He learned about my college education, my service. And he said, why don't you sit in on the afternoon class? Harold Berman taught the morning class, which I remember it being the concise history of the English common law. This is the Western legal tradition. The afternoon class was taught by a gentleman named Collins, I don't remember his first name, who had gone to Yale and was working in a law firm in Wall Street. And his course was the nature and function of law. So Doria said, why don't you sit in on the class this afternoon and see if you like it? And handed me the textbook and showed me the area of the textbook that the lessons for that day were on. And so during the lunch hour, I read, and the first case in that textbook was a case I remembered reading in my constitutional law class at the University of Vermont 5-some years prior. And I walked in. The classroom at that time, there may have been 100+ students, and there were only chairs. So you'd sit in a chair and you'd balance your book on one knee and you write your pad of paper to take notes on the other knee. And I walked in, and somewhere in the back, I got a chair. And I don't know how it ever possibly could have happened, but I was called on. Yeah. And I recognized the case, and I responded, and he called on me for a follow-up, and you know, because I remembered the case, I did quite well. And so after the class, Doria said, you did very well. Why don't you start Monday? I said, wait, I missed a week. And he says, oh, you can catch up. And so that's how I started law school. And as I said to Dave one time, how I got into law school without ever applying. And so I went home and told my wife, and she said, it can't be any good if they took you without an application. But he told me I'd get the GI Bill. So I said, I can go for 5 weeks. I'll get some education, and the GI Bill will pay for it. It doesn't cost me anything except 5 weeks. And that's how I got started. One other anecdote, when we were applying for, I don't know if it was provisional accreditation or the full accreditation, but Dean Debevoise came to me, I think it was probably my 3rd year, and said, Peter, you have no LSAT score in your file, and you only have a photocopy of a transcript which you gave when you entered. He said, can you get us a real transcript, and will you take the LSATs before the American Law School Accreditation Committee comes down and checks it? And so I did take an LSAT, but I took it when I was a 3rd-year student.
Wow, that's really funny. I can't imagine as a 3rd-year student going and taking the LSAT again and then later the bar. Thank you for that introduction, Peter. Let's turn it over to Professor Stephen Dycus. Why don't you introduce yourself and share how you came to Vermont Law School?
Afternoon, everybody. I joined the faculty in the school's 4th year, 1976. So I never met, nor did I have lunch with Anthony Doria. But I have to report that Dave Celone's characterization of Doria is the most benign that I've ever heard. All the stories I heard about Doria were pretty much the opposite. It was told to me that the reason Doria opened the law school in South Royalton is that he owned a lot of real estate in town. Law schools enrollments were booming at the time, and Doria thought it was a way for him to make a lot of money. The one thing he's credited with doing, according to my sources, was that he managed to recruit an all-star first board of trustees, which included Harold Berman from Harvard Law School, Sterry Waterman, who was the Second Circuit judge in Vermont, Bill Billings, who was the Chief Justice of the Vermont Supreme Court, and Tom Debevoise, who had been Attorney General in Vermont before he moved to Washington to set up an energy law practice. That's the same board that, once the student reported Doria's felony conviction, threw Doria out. It so happened that Tom Debevoise and his wonderful wife, Anne, who served on the school's board off and on for many, many years, had been looking for a reason to come back to Vermont. And so that was the reason that Tom did come back and take over the school in 70, at the beginning of the second year, I guess, and then served for eight more years. One thing about to remember about Tom Debevoise is that he brought with him an outlook, an attitude, a commitment to community and public service and shared responsibility and kindness that marked the school strongly from the beginning of his deanship, and that still characterizes the law school. Vermont Law School has always been different from other schools in this way, and continues to be. So Tom's legacy is a lovely one, and it's his influence over the institution is palpable even today. So that's what I remember best from the beginning.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Professor Dycus. And last but not least, Nina Thomas, will you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Nina Thomas. I grew up in South Royalton. My elementary education took place in what is now Debevoise Hall. In 1976, we had just purchased a house in South Royalton. My husband had just started his own plumbing business. So somebody needed a full-time job in order to make the house payments. And there was an opening, an ad in the newspaper for a secretary at Vermont Law School. I applied and am thankful forever that Tom Debevoise hired me.
Great. Well, welcome to all of our panelists, and thank you again for being here. And with that, let's get started with our first question. The first question I'm going to direct to Peter. What was it like on campus during the leadership transition from Doria?
I think there may have been as many as 110 to 120 students at that time. My class graduated 80, but I know we were larger the first year. So when you say what it was like, there was a lot of anxiety, but everybody demonstrated it a different way. There's anxiety first because at no point from when we started in the summer session or started in the fall did the promises made to us come true. With regard to promises such as what the library was, promises such as whether we would get actual desk to sit at rather than continuing to sit in a chair and balance books and many of those things. So there was anxiety anyway. We did not know if the school would ever become accredited and we would ever be able to take the bar exam. There was a promise, as I indicated earlier, that Doria had told me that initial meeting that I would get the GI Bill. And when I went in the next week to get the paperwork for it, he said, "Oh, well, you and Bill Boss, who was a classmate of mine, another veteran, you can be the committee to go and apply for the GI Bill for the school eligibility." And so Bill and I drove to the Veterans Administration in White River and told we had to go to the Department of Education in Montpelier. But anyway, so even by January, the GI Bill had been applied for, but the 5 veterans hadn't received their checks yet. So there was a lot of anxiety there. And then when that was found, there was even much more anxiety. Jeff Stahl, who was the president of our class bar association, actually drove down to Franklin Pierce and tried to negotiate a mass transfer for the class, but Franklin Pierce didn't accept that. There were some people who decided to leave, but most of us just said, we're here. At the time, it was a trimester system. We're in the middle of our winter term. We'll just keep our heads down and keep plodding away, while at the same time vocally making overtures to the Board of Trustees to replace Doria. So there was a lot of anxiety, but a lot of dedication to just keep going, write it out, and see what happens.
Well, you wrote it out, and here you are on this panel. Thank you for sharing that. For our next question, I'm going to do this to Nina. Could you talk a little bit about your role on campus and any memorable moments you recall from seeing decades of students come through the school, and share more about your experience with that?
Well, when I first started, I was supposed to be secretary to Mr. Kellogg, who had just started the placement office. And I also has started the Alumni Association. I had a box of index cards on my desk, which kept that information. I did housing, I did room reservations, I did the supply cabinet. And at the end of that year, enrollment for the following year was really down. So Mr. Kellogg sort of got shuttled to an adjunct professor, and Tom Debevoise took over as head of career services and placement office. And that started my very close and very special working relationship with Tom, who encouraged and supported and was convinced that I could be more than I thought I could be. And through the years, I mean, I've met so many wonderful students. The class of 1984 dedicated their yearbook to me, which was unexpected and so thankful. I got a classroom dedicated to me, and that was rather a funny incident in that Bruce Dutu, who was my boss at the time, came and said, I have a proposition for you, Nina, but he said, I want your permission first. And I said, well, what's that? And we were in the middle of the major renovation of Debevoise Hall. And he said, I want to name a room in your honor, and with the hope that primarily for the faculty to donate money, which they seems to have been a little lax at this point in time. And I looked at him and I said, well, that's not going to work. And he said, well, why not? And I said, I give them too much shit. They're not going to give any money in my name. And he said, well, let's just see what happens. And every single member of the faculty donated money. So that classroom over there where I spent second grade has my name on it. And that I'll always take with me.
Thank you, Nina. That's so lovely to hear.
Can I just jump in here very quickly to say that over many, many years, no one at Vermont Law School had a more profound influence on students' lives or was more beloved than Nina Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I can say from the current student perspective, it's great to be able to put a face to the name with your classroom and hear about your stories there. Yeah, a lot of students. It's part of our admissions tour now too when we go by it. Of fun fact, this is not the Nina Thomas room. This is the Nina Thomas room.
Right.
So that's great to hear about that. Going back to you, Peter, as well, what was the professional environment you and your students, or sorry, you and your classmates graduated into, and why did you decide to remain in South Royalton?
I think certainly as a tribute to Tom Debevoise and his reputation and that of Judge Billings and Judge Waterman, and I can only speak to the bar in Vermont. The bar in Vermont was not hostile to the Vermont Law School students. They were just questioning us. So as we said my third year, where you going to law school is only important for your first job. If we get that first job, we can prove we're entitled to get the next one. So I didn't find any resistance to my efforts to find a job. As a matter of fact, I did work at a private law firm, Mahady and Clavana, between my second and third year, during my third year, and into after graduation until I passed the bar and completed what was then a 6-month clerkship requirement. So I don't think the Vermont bar as a whole was hostile, but we were an unknown. And I suspect that if all else were equal, the one who had graduated from an accredited law school was taken over one who had graduated from a provisionally accredited law school. But that's only my guess, my speculation. So I had passed the bar and completed my clerkship requirements in the summer of '76. And I could have remained at the law firm I was working at. I was looking at other jobs, and Tom Debevoise made an offer to me to come back and work as an administrative position at the law school, and kind of talked me into, well, try it for a couple of years and see if you would like that sort of career path rather than practice. And that's what brought me back. My wife and I were already located in the area. We were expecting our first child, so having a good steady paycheck was welcomed. And I did enjoy my 2 years working as the assistant dean and director of admissions for Vermont Law School.
Great. I'm sure you've seen a lot of change over the years. South Royalton now has a new Jamaican restaurant, which is very exciting. So hopefully next time people are in town, you can check that out. Okay, our next question is for Professor Dycus. When did you begin to see the early seeds of what VLGS would become, particularly in relation to environmental law and policy?
Well, I discovered that Tom Debevoise had a commitment to protection of the environment from the beginning. I'm not sure when the first environmental law course was was offered, and the program in environmental law at the school really began in 1979 when Dick Brooks was hired as director of that program. David Firestone taught an environmental course, may still. But the program that Dick fashioned for the school was enormously successful. It was one of a kind when it began, although the environmental movement had been underway for more than 10 years at that point. And it was so good that it was copied by a number of other schools, including Lewis and Clark in Oregon, University of Utah, Colorado, and Pace Law School in New York. So emulation is the best complement, they say. And so the school developed a reputation as an environmental law school, although it never was that. It just had this marvelous program that's really helped develop the field of environmental law and had a huge influence on national policy.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, part of the reason I decided to come here was because of the environmental law program as well. So, obviously, I'm very happy with that addition back then. Nina, another question for you, is how did the administration support the development and growth of the environmental program? What do you remember from that perspective?
I don't remember anything specific. I just know that this was the mentality of what this could be that would be so special, because Vermont has a focus on environmental issues even back then, and no billboards, and it just seemed to be the appropriate place to focus on that, because there's no plan B for this planet if we screw it up any more than it has been. And I think that was always the focus in don't be wasteful. Be careful of the environment, be careful of the space around you. I remember when we were doing the grant application, somebody else did the major grant writing, but there was a questionnaire that went with it about, the institutional breakdown. And so I was working on that part, how many students did we have, how many professors, and Tom was overseeing it. And I got to the point where everything was done, except I kept looking at Dick Brooks's resume, and I thought, God, this is just awful. So I'm still relatively new at Vermont Law School. I went to Tom and I said, I don't like the way Dick put his resume together. And he looked at it and he said, well, why don't you change it, Nina? And I said, okay. I said, I'll make some changes and bring it back and you can look at it. And he said, no, just change it, add it to the pile and put it in the mail. So that's how, we started this, and the building, across the street, and then a whole new staff and new professors focusing on this particular area. The Costal coming up from whatever he did in DC, I forget now. And it just was, I think, what made us special.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. And now, before we open it up to questions from others in the Zoom, I wanted to ask Professor Dycus. We did get a question that said, or a statement from someone that said that he was a little saddened to hear that you didn't open your remarks with a poem. And that the integration of a few moments of calming words at the start of each session of wills, trusts, and estates have remained with him over the many years. So I don't know if you have a poem off of the top of your head, or anything you wanted to share in response to that.
I do have a poem, and I did start every class for most of my time at Vermont Law School with a poem. And I chose this one because it was 2 degrees below zero at my house last night in Stratford. The poem is by Robert Frost. It's called Fire and Ice. Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. Robert Frost. So there's a poem that relates not only to the weather, but also to our current political situation.
Lovely. Thank you. Another question we have for you, even though you're not teaching, is if you still teach, do you bring a lunchbox to class still?
I don't remember doing that. I always loved eating in the little cafeteria, and the food was good, and the company was better. So.
That's great. Okay, let's see what other questions we might have. If anyone is here and also wants to ask a question live, please feel free to raise a hand, or I know we're monitoring the Q&A chat. Well, as we're waiting for those to come in, I know we're getting a lot of comments and hellos to everyone on the panel. But while we're waiting, maybe I'll ask another question for everyone on the panel. With the earliest classes, what really set the earliest classes apart? And in what ways have you seen the student population change over the years? And feel free, Nina, I don't know if you want to start this one.
I think Peter will agree with me. His class they were probably older. And as the years progressed, the students became younger. And more diverse and coming from all different aspects. We had, the Native American program for a while. We had the exchange program with the University of Trento in Italy, which was wonderful because I got to take my daughter there. And so we just kept changing our focus sometimes. And at some point in time, I finally said, you can't be a jack of all trades, master of none. maybe you just need to narrow in your focus a little bit instead of keep adding all these spokes. I didn't always bite my tongue when I probably should have for all the years that I was here. But, just an amazing range of students with, watching them have, their babies and getting married and going to their weddings and all of that. As I said before, just enriched my life so much. I don't have any grandchildren. I have great nieces and nephews, and so I live vicariously through the alums and their babies, and have kept in touch with quite a few as of watching their kids grow up, and it's just has enriched my life so much being part of this very unique, as I said, whatever serendipitous event brought you to Vermont Law School, you can never, ever leave that behind. It will always be a part of you because there's nothing else out there like it, which makes it unique and special. And it will continue to grow and enrich more lives as you continue to support it.
I like Nina, remember the first classes as being a little older. Also remember a number of Vietnam War veterans in my classes, and they certainly enriched the experience in the classroom. When the first Master's in Environmental Law program began, my class in water law always had a handful of forest rangers and oceanographers and chemists, people like that, and they made the classes a lot more fun because they brought a completely different perspective and different experience to the classroom.
I'm not able to speak to how classes have changed over time, but certainly my class and the classes I knew during my time at VLS probably had an experience between college and joining law school, a work experience, a military experience, or whatever. And I think at that time, most of us were just appreciated the fact that we were in law school, and we just kind of put our head down to get through law school. I don't remember anyone talking about a focused practice or a focused program in law school. I don't think I did take an environmental law course my second year, so it was offered, but I don't think we ever took an advanced course in any particular area. And we were just studying to be general practitioners and took a broad array of courses. And for me, who after I worked at Vermont Law School, then I worked with the Vermont Attorney General's office, then I opened my own small town practice. And it was very much a general practice. I took whatever matter came in that I felt comfortable taking. And having had that broad array of classes over the 3 years, I think helped me dig into whatever type of case I was taking, and I think handle it quite well.
Lovely. Thank you all for responding to that. It's funny, and I know you're talking about the Trentos trip. That's still happening. It's happening
It is still
again
happening.
in this spring, and yeah, that's lovely that you were able to take your daughter as well. I'm looking through some of we're getting a lot of comments and hellos to everyone.
I'll add one thing about how the student population has changed, and maybe this has to do with the online hybrid JD program and the online classes, master's degree classes. mean, some of these are now starting to skew maybe a little bit back more towards the ages that Peter's class experienced, because the online classes tend to skew into the mid 30s age-wise, as opposed to the residential classes, which are more in the mid 20s still. And so that online hybrid JD program in particular has grown fairly dramatically in just 4 years. And it has now, I think, gotten to the point where it was 153 students in the incoming 1L class this year versus 4 years ago. The very first inaugural class had, and my numbers are going to be a little bit off, but maybe 18 students. So it's really grown. And so that not only have students, of course, in that program are scattered all over the country. So that's another maybe differentiation of how things have changed a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great segue into one of our questions that we got from Jordan Carpenter, perhaps for Nina. How did you decide which students to recruit, and was there ever a decision to recruit regionally versus nationally or vice versa? Jordan says, I am a Southerner who moved to South Royalton from Alabama and is so glad that he did.
I really didn't have anything to do with recruiting.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
I
I
just
guess
took
that,
care of them once they got here.
okay. That's great. And it sounds like you did a great job welcoming everyone there. So let's turn to this other question from John Shia. Steve, what motivated you to write the skeleton key to Professor Dick Brooks's The Refurbishing? Well done.
Well, Dick Brooks is just uh, as much as anyone responsible for the not just for the environmental law program, but for the prominence and huge influence that Vermont Law School has become over time. So the title of the article is a kind of an inside joke, a reference to something between Dick and me, but it was my way of trying to pay tribute to Dick and his love of the law and the wonderful influence he had on the institution. In reference to the earlier question, Vermont Law School never has been a Vermont school. It's always been a national law school. There have been suggestions over time that the school focus more regionally or locally, but the others have resisted that effort and thought that the school could and should speak to a much wider audience. And indeed, it has done that.
Yeah, and I think
more than about 2/3, maybe more, of every class has been from somewhere else, not from Vermont. And most have gone back where they came from.
yeah, I think a lot of people would like to stay in Vermont long term, and it's funny that you say that as well, because my entering 1L year, our Dean of Admissions, Katie Merrill, shares, the top 3 states represented among the incoming students. And this past year, I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe Vermont was one of the states where we have a higher percentage of Vermonters coming back this year. So that's pretty exciting. Professor Dycus, we have a couple little questions for you. One, did you continue to have students over to your home to enjoy homemade chili and community sharing? And also, do you still stay on top of national security law?
Well, the answer to the first question is we didn't do enough of that. It was always fun to meet students face to face outside of class. I always told my classes that I had never, ever heard of a law professor turning down an invitation to lunch. And so I enjoyed eating in the cafe with students. As for national security law, that's a topic that I really took up in earnest in the early 1980s. And beginning in 1984, decided with a colleague of mine at Boston College to put together a law school course called National Security Law. That evolved over several years into the first publication of that book by Little Brown in 1990. And that book was published in its 8th edition, now by Aspen, became one of the Little Red Case books by Aspen in 2024. At that point, after nearly 40 years in the project, I've stepped out and turned it over to others to continue. But I continue to write, most recently helping with amicus briefs in cases involving the domestic deployment of National Guard troops.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, it's funny you're talking about amicus briefs. I'm part of one of our environmental advocacy clinics on campus, and we recently filed an amicus as well. So it's nice to hear some similarities in times and things that don't really change. There's always a need, I guess, for filing more amicus briefs. Yeah, I guess my next question for panel members is from James McLeod. Do any panel members know if the reason for changing the approach of grading pass or fail was to focus on just the learning and to put off competition for the best grade in the remaining semesters? What was the reasoning for having that? He said his first semester in 1980 was graded pass or fail, which I can say as a student now, we do not have that anymore.
We didn't have pass or fail when I was a student.
I mean, I wasn't the registrar then, but I don't remember it being pass or fail either. I mean, it always, from when I took over, it was you got grades, and the person with the highest grade got, some piece of paper with an award saying, you got the best grade in whatever estates. And I don't know why they ever did pass fail. Maybe just to take the pressure off being a 1L, until you got to figure out what was going on and take the pressure off. Sounds like a good idea, maybe.
I never graded pass fail. Indeed, I got the reputation, which I cultivated carefully, of being known as D- Dycus.
D- Dycus.
But the fact was that students in my classes did just as well overall as they did in their other classes. I graded on a curve. Some of the absolute number grades were disappointing, but in the end, signing up for a class with me, at least in that respect, was no worse than with anyone else.
That's funny. D-Dycus. I've never heard of that. That is a really funny nickname to have. Okay. Yeah, and then I guess another question, if everyone is willing to share, um, I know we've kind of touched a little bit upon this already, but can you speak about how the campus has evolved over time and its sense of place within Royalton and Vermont as VLS has grown as an institution, and how new buildings or facilities have shaped that development? And I guess let's start with Peter this time.
Well, I'm not sure that I can speak to how it's grown over time. Certainly, when I was my first year there in 1973, there was the main classroom building, the old Royalton School building, and there was a very small annex, which was the library. That library was expanded in our second year, and I think it was completely replaced. No, the back room was left on for the stacks, but the quote new library, which was new in 1975, 76, was built for my third year. The large building as you're facing to the right, is that Debevoise Hall? That was built after I left, but and the Victorian house next to the left of the classroom building was purchased, I think, right after I graduated. And those are the only buildings I know of for Vermont laws. Well, no, the environmental law building across the street was purchased even after I left my administrative position. I don't know how much more it has grown. Certainly the size of the student body has grown, but I don't know about the physical facility.
Yeah, absolutely. Nina, do you have anything you want to add?
I, that was one thing, especially about the law school. And again, Anthony Doria coming to town, buying up properties relatively cheaply. And, you ended up, as Peter said, with old Victorian houses that, a family couldn't afford to live in them anymore. And so the law school did acquire quite a few buildings, Pierce House across the street, over on North Windsor Street, a couple of houses there, Carpenter House. Anyway, so there's a lot of additions of buying up property, but we also built new or took like what was the old high school. This was way before my time. That then they refurbished that and they became the writing program. So we took up a lot of space and we took buildings that would have probably been idle and deteriorating if we hadn't done that. So I think that was another plus to the picture of what South Royalton was and is.
Aside from what was originally the library that Peter talked about, now the Chase Center, the two main additions to the campus were the newer Cornell Library and the new classroom building sitting on the north side of Debevoise Hall. I remember another building or structure that was built back, I won't say in whose administration, but was thought of as sort of goofy and inappropriate, both in its appearance and place. It was a sort of a picnic shelter built along the lower driveway. One day during the Shields administration. And we had a big storm. And at the end of the storm, this little structure was gone. And I remember Jeannie Shields saying about the structure, "Oh, darn." My feeling as well.
I remember, and Peter, maybe you remember this, but I think it was someone from your class who told me that there was a spring melt, and your class watched like a Volkswagen floating down the White River. I mean, so these storms do periodically come through.
It was the spring thaw, and an ice dam was created either under the bridge or just north of the bridge, which backed the water up. There were tennis courts down at the river level, which when I first started, those tennis courts later became a parking lot. And it was during exams in the middle of the winter, so it'd be just before Christmas exams. So it wasn't a spring melt, it was a quick winter thaw that backed it up, and several of the cars were floated. And probably the Volkswagen was floated out of its place rather than just raised. And there was a lot of students were pretty upset that they hadn't been called during their exam to move their car. On the other hand, I think that the water rose so fast that nobody even understood it until it was there. And ice dam can back water up pretty quickly. I do remember that. My car was not in the lower lot.
The same thing happened the following year. And I remember standing in the classroom while indeed an exam was underway. And I did indeed see a Volkswagen float across the parking lot and come to rest down by the edge of the bridge.
So another quick couple of thoughts on buildings. There's also the Multicultural Center now in Deering House on the first floor. So that's a relatively new addition to campus, I think as of about 6 years ago or so, thereabouts. And then prior to that, another renovation was on the corner where Chelsea Street meets South Windsor Street, which is where Barrister's Bookstore is now. And it's our clinical building as well, the Center for Clinical Services that houses the South Royalton Legal Clinic, the Environmental Advocacy Clinic, Environmental Justice Clinic, has housed the Center for Justice Reform Clinic, but I think that's now moved up to the Burlington office. So that's another change. We have a Burlington office. But I think overall, the housing, and Nina referenced this, this school has given many people opportunities to rent spaces in their homes to students. And so I mean, there's an economic factor, an economic benefit as well, that this school has contributed to the town, not merely by bringing students in and paying faculty and so forth, but also the residents have been able to benefit from that as well.
They have. I mean, a lot of them took these old Victorian houses and broke them up into apartments and really created an income for, a lot of the older residents who own these old houses. So it was always a surprise to me, having lived here all my life, to find still some negative feelings from the locals against the law school. And I've never been able to figure that out, because we have brought so much good to this little town that, were it not for Vermont Law School, would probably no longer exist.
Yeah, and what you were sharing before, Dave, the small business law clinic also is housed in that building. I'm actually in the South Royalton Legal Clinic right now. So this is one of those newer buildings. And then Nina, what you're talking about the economy and supporting locals, I think actually I think it was last year, there was a podcast episode that was released, and it's a short 20-30 minute episode, and it talks a little bit about now VLGS and how we contribute to the community. And generally, a lot of locals had a lot of positive things to say.
Yes.
So I recommend, if anyone hasn't heard that, looking it up. Um,
Yeah,
uh,
and Kaya, if I may, I think you make a great point about the clinics. That's another thing that's changed fairly dramatically, I feel like, is that while many law schools have legal clinics, they tend to be sort of the general clinics like we had, which was the South Royalton Legal Clinic, and it would take largely sort of family law cases when I was a student, then civil cases, but that's now become focused on veterans and family. And then we have all these other clinics, like you've just mentioned, right? You're in this clinical building. There's the small business law clinic. There's a farmed animal clinic. There's an ag and food systems clinic, an immigration clinic under the name of the Center for Justice Reform Clinic. So these niche clinics have important niches in the law and policy have sprung up during this period of probably the past 25 years or so, that are serving the community in lots of ways, as pro bono, offering pro bono clinical legal services.
mhm. Yeah, and the name of the podcast, it's Brave Little State on Vermont Public, if anyone is interested. We also got a question of, isn't there exercise facility on campus now? And yes, there is. There is a little gym in a separate building, but that is here as well. I also wanted to just open it up again and ask if any attendees want to unmute and share memories or ask any questions. If so, feel free to raise a hand and we can allow you to share, or you can drop it in the Q&A.
While we're
Go
waiting,
ahead.
I'm just going to add to the clinic discussion. My third year, there was a clinical program where students who enrolled in that program would be placed I was placed with the Public Defender's Office in Montpelier, several public defender's offices, legal aid offices, and state's attorney offices had students placed in those offices for the clinic program. But it was all the public, there were no private offices. And it was all outplacement, it wasn't school sponsored.
Mm-hmm.
Or school run.
Yeah, that's great. We still have a lot of clinic and then externship programs happening now, that are still continuing.
I think it would be a mistake to conclude this program of remembrances without talking about Shirley Jefferson and her role in the law school over many years. Shirley, as most of you will remember, has been responsible for as Dean of Students and for a course in race and law. She has helped, well, pretty much single-handedly made the school more diverse incidentally than most law schools. And her kindness has just had a huge influence on everybody in the community, and we're really grateful to her.
Yeah, absolutely. VP Jefferson is great, and she's still an active member of the community. And I've worked with her before and really value her expertise as well. Thank you for sharing that. It looks like we have a question. Joy, if you want to come off mute and share your question or your comments, we'd love to hear it.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm not sure if my video is on or not. I don't know. I'm not the best at this kind of stuff. But anyway, I was in the class of 1984, and I had come to Vermont after college and did a lot of different jobs as an advocate, apple picker, waitress, different things like that. And when I decided to go to law school, I went to a good college and my grades were okay, but my SATs were not the best. They weren't the worst, but they weren't the best. And I just want to just say publicly how thankful I am that Vermont Law School accepted me as a student. And it was just such an incredible experience. And I did go on to have an amazing career as a solo practitioner and spent a lot of my career just providing services to middle-class people who might not have been able to afford another lawyer or who didn't feel comfortable in, very, let's just say I had a very relaxed office and people were comfortable. And I just want to thank the people at Vermont Law School. And I do remember taking Professor Dycus's class and I remember Nina and, I'm not sure they remember me. It doesn't really matter, but I just wanted to say that publicly, how grateful I was. And, sometimes I wonder when you start getting into statistics of, making sure your law school has, is only taking the top students and, uh, you know, making sure that your rankings are based on SAT scores and other things. And I hope that Vermont Law School will continue to accept people who have passion and intelligence, but maybe don't exactly fit into some of those parameters.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
always been the case, Joy, and I'm so glad, and I hope it is continuing because I didn't work closely with admissions, but they never looked just at the numbers. Those essays were extremely important in telling them who you were and perhaps what your potential was. So it was not always about the numbers, and I'm thankful for that too.
Thank goodness they didn't look at the LSAT scores. Well, they looked at them, but they considered other things, at least in my case.
Yeah,
I
don't
do want
listen to
to
Dave. They do.
No one ever looked at
they
mine.
definitely do. I mean,
But
LSAT scores tend to be an indicator of bar passage, so it's an important metric. But I do see, and I'll try to interject briefly here. I see a question about the Institute for Energy and the Environment, and that's what brought me to VLS and SORO. And I will say I didn't mention as part of the clinics, certainly the energy clinic, the environmental advocacy clinic, the environmental justice clinics, sort of the whole environmental side of clinical work and experiential work. I think I did mention farmed animal and ag and food systems, but those are all very important and frankly popular clinics among our students. The energy clinic students call themselves energizers, and I think the Institute for Energy and the Environment was carried for so long by Professor Kevin Jones, who unfortunately has passed away in the classroom while teaching a couple of years ago. It was a sad story, but he was an extraordinary man who really devoted himself as much to helping students find success, find career paths, coaching them, as Professor Dycus mentioned about Dean and now Vice President Shirley Jefferson, who spent so much time and effort recruiting students and traveling for the school, at historically Black colleges and universities, and trying to develop, right in the heart of Vermont, a really diverse student body that has defined the school in so many ways very positively.
yeah, I think I just one quick note. Also with what our prior question regarded, I think that this school has been really good in recruiting diverse candidates and considering more beyond numbers, like Nina was saying. That was one of the reasons it drew Vermont Law was attractive for me and why I'm here. And yeah, I wanted to let our next person, Mike Jacobson, if you want to come off mute and share your question or comment.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I want to say that I remember in the library the rolling racks that contained library books. Does anybody else remember those?
I do.
Yeah. Edna, I understand that you were encouraged to attend VLS because of Larry Olive. How long did you maintain your friendship with Larry?
I don't believe Edna can respond to that live, but maybe she can put an answer in the Q&A and can share that with you. Oh, there's Edna. Edna, do you want to come off mute and respond to that?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Larry and I have stayed in touch. I haven't touched base with him recently. And even for, I guess, a year or so after I came out of law school, I worked with Larry briefly. He is a very interesting person, and I'm very grateful to him for suggesting that I apply to Vermont.
Great, thank you. And it looks like Nina, Mike also commented in the chat that he often thinks of you fondly, and it's good to see you today. I'm sure everyone here today agrees we received an education at VLS, now VLGS, unlike the education of our colleagues. And then, by the way, he recently met a newly admitted attorney who used Berman's transcript as a hardbound textbook in one of his courses. Okay.
In that course, we had photocopies of a typed, Berman had just a typed draft of his history of the English common law.
Cool. As we're waiting to see if there are any other last minute questions, I was just going to go through. Oh, Mike Jacobson, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I was temporarily disconnected by a spam call that came in. Is Edna still on this call? I wanted to know how long she was friendly with Larry Olive.
I don't know that she's here right now, but again, maybe she can drop that in the Q&A.
I'm still here.
Oh, okay, there you are.
Larry and I have stayed in touch. I haven't spoken with him recently, but after I came out of VLS, and I think for one of the summers, I worked for him in his law office, but I did stay in touch with Larry.
Okay, well, I need to inform you that Larry passed away just a few years ago.
Yes, I do remember that.
Yeah, but he was one hell of a guy. He was a very prestigious attorney, and he was the mayor of Montclair in New Jersey.
He was. Yep.
Yes. Nina, I want to say to you that I only have fond memories of you, and it's good to see you today.
I have wonderful memories of you too, Mike.
Well, thank you. And finally, I want to say,
And Edna too.
Hi, Nina. It's good to see you.
I can't see you, but hi.
and I want everybody to know that when I speak to my colleagues about my legal education, my legal education was so superior to the education which my colleagues have received, mostly because of Berman and Teachout's courses, which oriented me for the rest of my matriculation at Vermont Law School. Does anybody else share that experience?
I think a lot of people do, and Professor Teachout is still here teaching. I do think that, he's been here a long time, and I think he has a lot of fans that continue to really appreciate the work he does. I know actually when we were just talking about the Trento trip, he teaches that and leads the trip. I think this year is his last year where he's co-teaching it before handing it over to one of the newer professors. Not new. She's been here for a while, Professor Connolly. But yeah.
And lastly, I recently met a newly admitted attorney, and I was talking to him about my legal education compared to his. And I mentioned Harold Berman's transcript, which is the way that we used his textbook. It was still in the manuscript form. And this guy used the same book, but his had already been bound into a hardcover book. And that was very impressive, that the manuscript that I learned from ultimately did become a textbook, and that it was being used in other law schools.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. I think we are about to wrap it up. We are running out of time, but before we say goodbye, I just wanted to read a couple of different comments that we've gotten and compliments within the chat, because I think they're really nice and sweet. We have a comment talking about Nina and Nancy White in the admissions office and how both made an impact on the students' experience at VLS. We have a compliment for Professor Dycus, remembering your poems very well, especially Robert Frost, and it being great to see all of you. And then last but not least, there's this comment that shares that Nina Thomas was a huge reason for whatever success I had at VLS, and I am so glad to see you here. My time at VLS taught me to be a critical thinker and taught me to value each person for the gifts they can bring to the collective betterment of any situation. I wish more educational organizations were like VLS. So thank you all for joining us. This has been a really great discussion, and thank you to our panelists for being here and sharing more about your experiences and everything you've seen over the years. And happy Founding Day and happy last day of classes for students.